In the spring of 1945, a schoolteacher named Erzsébet lived in a modest apartment in Budapest with her husband, a civil engineer, and their 2 children. By the standards of Hungarian society, they were comfortable. Not wealthy, but stable. She had a salary. He had a salary. They had savings in a postal account, accumulated carefully over 14 years. They owned their furniture, their books, a small radio. They were, by any reasonable measure, exactly the kind of family that a functioning society is built around. By August 1946, 16 months later, those savings were worth nothing. Not reduced, not damaged, nothing. The Hungarian pengo had undergone the most severe hyperinflation ever recorded in history. Prices doubling at the peak every 15 hours. No, the number printed on the largest banknote issued during that period contained more zeros than most people can read aloud without losing count. But here is the detail that matters most, and that most accounts of the Hungarian hyperinflation skip past entirely. Erzsébet and her husband did not lose their savings in August 1946. They lost them in the spring of 1945, when they decided the situation was temporary. When they looked at their postal account, saw the number, and chose to believe that the institution behind that number was more durable than the currency it was denominated in. When they waited, the savings did not disappear in the final collapse. They disappeared in the confidence lag, the months between when the signal was clear and when they accepted what the signal meant. This is the mistake, not a single dramatic error. But not a failure of intelligence or information, a slow, entirely rational feeling series of decisions, each of which made sense in the moment, that collectively produced the same outcome as if they had simply given the money away. And it did not happen to Erzsébet alone. It happened to the middle class, specifically, repeatedly, across every hyperinflation of the last 100 years. Not the very poor. They had little to lose in the currency to begin with. Not the ultra-wealthy. They had advisors, international connections, assets that were not denominated in the domestic currency. The middle class, the savers, the professionals, the people who had done everything right and built something real. They are the ones the confidence lag destroys. Every time. The surface explanation is that hyperinflation destroys savings. That is true, but incomplete. The deeper question is why the people most damaged were specifically the ones who had the most savings, the most institutional trust, and the most to lose from waiting. The answer runs through 3 cases and 1 cognitive mechanism that has never changed. Go to Germany. Not 1923. The peak, the wheelbarrows of notes, the famous images. Go to 1921. 2 years earlier. The inflation is already present. The mark has already lost significant value against foreign currencies. Prices are rising. But the German middle class, the Mittelstand, the backbone of Wilhelmina and Weimar society, is still holding, still keeping savings in mark-denominated accounts, still trusting the Reichsbank, still believing, with considerable historical justification, that Germany is a sophisticated industrial economy with functioning institutions, and that sophisticated industrial economies with functioning institutions do not simply print their currency into worthlessness. That belief was not irrational. It was based on 100 years of evidence. The German banking system had been, by 19th century standards, a model of institutional reliability. The mark had been a stable currency for decades before the First World War. The people holding their savings in marks in 1921 were not naive. They were trusting an institution that had, for their entire lives and their parents' lives, deserved trust. What they were not accounting for was that the institution they trusted, the Reichsbank, the German government, the political structure of Weimar, was operating under pressures that were categorically different from anything in the previous 100 years. War reparations under the Treaty of Versailles, a devastated industrial base, political instability that made coherent fiscal policy nearly impossible. The institution looked the same from the outside. The conditions it was operating under were not. The confidence lag in Germany lasted roughly 2 years for most middle-class savers. Between 1921 and late 1923, the window in which conversion from marks into tangible assets, foreign currency, physical goods, productive property, would have preserved significant value remained open. It narrowed progressively. By the time most middle-class families accepted what was happening, the window had closed. What the historical record from that period shows in the letters and diaries and later testimonies of German middle-class families is not panic. It is a sequence of reasonable-sounding decisions. Wait and see. Surely it will stabilize. The government cannot let this continue. It would be extreme to convert everything into dollars. We would look foolish if it corrects next month. Each decision extended the confidence lag by weeks or months, and each extension made the eventual outcome worse. Here is the reversal that should complicate this picture, because it very nearly inverts everything that feels obvious about who suffers most in hyperinflation. The German working class, specifically the organized industrial workers, the unionized factory employees, recovered from the Weimar hyperinflation faster than the middle class. Yet not immediately, not without hardship, but structurally faster. Why? Because the working class had less confidence in the institution to begin with, not through superior financial analysis, but through a different relationship with money and institutions built over generations of experience. Industrial workers in 1920s Germany were accustomed to wages that needed to be spent quickly. They had less accumulated in mark-denominated savings. They were already psychologically closer to a world where the currency was a tool for immediate exchange rather than a store of long-term value. When the mark began to collapse, the working class converted wages into goods almost immediately: food, clothing, fuel, because that was already close to their existing behavior. They did not have a confidence lag of the same duration. They had less to lose in the lag and less trust in the institution that created it. The middle class had more savings, more trust, more to lose, and a longer confidence lag as a direct result of those three things. That inversion, that the people who had done more right were more exposed, is the pattern that makes hyperinflation specifically devastating to the middle class. It is not random. It is structural. The confidence lag is longer precisely because the trust was deeper. If you want to understand how different middle-class families across different hyperinflations responded differently, and what distinguished the ones who preserved something from the ones who did not, that is exactly what we go deeper on in the next video. Move forward. Zimbabwe, 2000s. The hyperinflation that peaked in 2008 is, by measured rate, the second most severe in recorded history after Hungary, 1946. At its peak, monthly inflation was estimated in the millions of %. The Zimbabwean dollar ultimately became worthless by any functional measure. But go to 2003, 5 years earlier. The inflation is already running at triple digits annually. The Zimbabwean dollar is already losing value faster than any stable economy citizen would find believable. And the professional class, teachers, doctors, engineers, civil servants, the people who had built careers in a functioning post-independence economy, is still being paid in Zimbabwean dollars, still keeping accounts in Zimbabwean dollars, still, in many cases, believing that the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe, the institutions of a sovereign state, would find a way to stabilize. The confidence lag in Zimbabwe ran for years before the final collapse, and the middle-class professionals who maintained it longest, who kept the most in Zimbabwean dollar-denominated savings, who were slowest to convert into foreign currency, physical assets, or productive holdings, ended careers and retirements that represented decades of skilled labor with effectively nothing. The ones who converted earlier, who accepted earlier what the inflation data was clearly showing, preserved more. Not because they were wealthier, not because they had access to information others did not, because they closed their own confidence lag before the institution closed it for them. What makes the Zimbabwe case particularly instructive is the mechanism of conversion that worked. Not gold, primarily. Not foreign bank accounts, all which required access that many did not have. The most documented form of wealth preservation among Zimbabwean middle-class families in that period was physical goods and productive capacity. Teachers who bought building materials early, cement, roofing iron, timber, and stored them found that those materials held value as the dollar collapsed. Small business owners who converted dollar revenues into inventory immediately, rather than holding cash, preserved something. Farmers who held land and produced food had a direct hedge that no financial instrument could replicate. The function principle, again. What you own that does something, that grows food, that shelters people, that provides a service, retains a floor when the currency measuring its value ceases to function. Not all hyperinflations produce identical outcomes, and that matters. The German hyperinflation of 1923 was resolved, dramatically, abruptly, by the introduction of the Rentenmark in November of that year. Within months, a functioning currency had been restored. Many German families rebuilt through the 1920s, though the psychological and financial damage to the middle class shaped German politics for the remainder of the decade in ways that historians have documented extensively. The Hungarian hyperinflation of 1945–46 was also resolved by currency reform, with the introduction of the forint. Zimbabwe eventually dollarized its economy in 2009, abandoning the Zimbabwean dollar entirely and restoring functional commerce. These were not permanent ends. Most people survived. Most economies rebuilt. But the middle class in each case rebuilt from a lower starting point than they had occupied before. The savings were gone. The pensions were gone. The accumulated financial security of careers spent doing the right things, saving, not speculating, trusting the institutions, was gone. That loss, in many cases, was permanent at the individual level, even as the economy recovered at the aggregate level. Here is the mechanism that ties all three cases together, and it is simpler than it first appears. The confidence lag exists because trust in institutions is not updated the same way that prices are. Prices update in real time. You can see the number on the shelf change. Trust updates slowly, because trust is built on decades of experience. And the human mind is extremely reluctant to conclude that an institution it has relied on for a lifetime has fundamentally changed. This is not a failure of intelligence. The German professional who kept savings in marks through 1921 and 1922 was not stupid. The Zimbabwean teacher who kept faith in the Reserve Bank through 2004 and 2005 was not naive. They were doing what humans do with institutions they have trusted over long periods. They were extending the benefit of the doubt. They were applying historical evidence. This institution has been reliable, to a situation where the conditions underlying that evidence had changed. The mistake was not trusting the institution. It was not updating the trust when the evidence changed. Not dramatically, incrementally. Each month of rising prices was, individually, something that could be rationalized. The lag was composed of individually reasonable decisions that accumulated into an unreasonable outcome. The wealthy escaped it not because they trusted less, but because they had assets that were not denominated in the domestic currency to begin with. The working class escaped the worst of it, not because they were wiser, but because they had less accumulated trust to lose. The middle class, specifically the savers, the professionals, the people who had built financial security through institutional participation, bore the heaviest cost because they had the most confidence to lag. Come back to Erzsébet's apartment in Budapest. Spring of 1945. The postal account with 14 years of savings. The decision to wait. She was not wrong to have saved. She was not wrong to have trusted the institution. She was living in a world that had, for the previous 14 years, rewarded exactly those behaviors. What she could not know, what nobody in her position could easily know, was that the conditions underlying the institution's reliability had been destroyed by a war that the institution itself had not survived intact. The confidence lag is not a character flaw. It is a rational response to the world that existed before the crisis. The problem is that it is calibrated to the previous world, not the current one. The question the historical record keeps raising across Germany, Hungary, Zimbabwe, and every other documented hyperinflation is not whether you trust the institutions around you. Most of the time, in most places, that trust is warranted and rational. The question is whether you have a way of knowing when the conditions underlying that trust have changed. Not dramatically, quietly. In the data that is already visible, months or years before the confidence lag closes on its own. What is the inflation rate in the currency your savings are denominated in right now? What is the real return, after inflation, on the account where you keep your financial security? And how long would you wait, watching that number, before you concluded that the institution behind it had changed in some fundamental way? Those are not alarmist questions. They are the questions that Erzsébet and the German civil servant and the Zimbabwean teacher each wished someone had asked them to sit with, not in the final collapse, but in the quiet months before, when the signal was already there and the window was still open.